All right. Happy Sunday, guys. Welcome to Sabby Sabs podcast. I'm your host, sabrinasalvati. My special guest tonight is Anya Parampil. She is an investigative journalist for The Gray Zone, and she recently published a book titled Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of U.S. Empire. Welcome, Anya, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Sabby. I know it's long overdue, but I've kind of been in writer's lockdown, and I'm slowly emerging back to reality, or at least online media reality.
No, I totally understand. I've been telling people too, because I know everyone keeps saying, when are you going to write that article? I have a housing article that I'm supposed to write. And I feel like every time I sit down to do it, I get distracted by something else. So I'm just going to have to, like you said, just buckle down and get it done.
Yeah, unfortunately, writing is one of those things where can't really have time for anything else. It's grueling.
No, I agree. So you have a new book that was published. I just want to go ahead and show everyone here, because I did see it on Amazon. Corporate Coup, Venezuela and the End of the U.S. Empire. I believe this goes on sale. I think it says January on Amazon.
Right. So it'll actually publish, if you buy it directly from my publisher, orbooks.com, then it will ship in November. That's when they'll get a copy. That's when they'll have it, and that's when it'll get to people who order it through them, which means then the third-party vendors will be sending it out in January, which is why Amazon has that date.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. Well, I'm curious because I know a lot of you travel. I know when I talked to Danny Haifong, I know he's particularly interested in China. So different journalists have certain areas of the world where they are focused. And I'm curious, what interested you about Venezuela? Because I know there's a lot of conflict that has happened there, and it tends to be a little, I feel like Venezuela is one of those countries where if you talk about it, and depending on how you talk about Venezuela, people can look at you with a side eye, especially if it doesn't go with the narrative that the State Department has. So why were you interested in Venezuela to begin with?
I'm so glad you asked me that question, because it's actually exactly how I begin my book. In the preface of the book, I have, why are you so interested in Venezuela? This is a question I've gotten many times over the years. And my answer, I say, also has evolved over the years. Basically, in the beginning, when I was very young and just in school, idealistic about politics, I always thought that Chavez was just a very compelling figure. I remember when he got in front of the UN Security Council and gave a speech saying, "The devil spoke here yesterday and it still smells like sulfur." And he was talking about George W. Bush. Thought that was pretty cool. And as someone who comes from left-wing progressive politics, or at least what that was considered to be in the early 2000s, I was drawn and interested in the revolution that Chavez led there beginning in 1998. Kind of is just an interesting study, or a case study in what a different model of government can be. And so I always followed Venezuela in the news and was very interested in covering it back when I worked for RT, but I never had the chance to actually go until after I left RT. That's actually a funny story. Basically, I wanted to go cover the 2018 presidential election in Venezuela, but RT couldn't send me because the insurance premium they would have had to purchase in order for me to go was so high that it really just made the trip impossible. And that was crazy, because they'd sent me to Palestine, they'd sent me to Korea. But that experience actually taught me about the level of the economic war that has been waged on Venezuela. Because the US declared Venezuela a national security threat in 2015 under Barack Obama, the insurance, just simply because the US said that, which means the US could declare war on Venezuela any moment, raised the cost of not only people like me through media outlets like RT traveling to Venezuela, but also international shipping companies that were bringing their products. All of that price just skyrocketed overnight. And so that was kind of my first taste of getting a look at what the war on Venezuela was without even going. Then in January 2019, by then I was no longer with RT, and that was when I was starting out at the Gray Zone, and the Gray Zone was kind of starting out as this independent project with me, Max, and Aaron. That was the same month also that the Trump administration just happened to appoint this shadow puppet regime led by Juan Guaido as the government of Venezuela, and implement a coup, or actually even say that they had completed a coup before a change in government had actually taken place. And because we were all interested in Venezuela, as I said, for the reasons I described before, we kind of decided, look, it's close enough to the United States that it's not kind of a difficult trip logistically to try and get the visas, but we were able to do that through contacts that we had here in DC, and we went. And I am helped when I go there by the fact that I studied Spanish in school. I feel like I was able to get a sense and real feel for the country in a way that other places where I've traveled in Europe, or if I were to go to China, let's say, I wouldn't necessarily get, or Russia, I wouldn't get the same level of communication and understanding. But because I can speak Spanish, and because I mean, Venezuelans are very similar to us in a lot of ways, just as also being Americans, part of this American continent, I really got just a good sense of the country, and I made good contacts. And so through that, it just became something that I couldn't stop covering, because it was such a dramatic period back in 2019, 2020. There was always some crazy story going on, whether it was the Embassy Protection Collective or the Operation Gideon failed mercenary invasion that happened in May 2020. I couldn't stop, because I had contacts on all sides that it helped me helped inform my understanding and my coverage. And it was just so fascinating that as a reporter, it just became this focus of mine. And I love Venezuela. If you go there, you will love it too. Anybody who goes there and meets the people and sees what it's all about will fall in love.
I had a former student that was from Venezuela, and he told me that he never wanted to go back there. And he was talking about the different like crimes that were happening there. Like he was telling me, and I don't know if you've experienced any of this or you saw any of it, but he told me that in Venezuela, it had gotten to the point where it was dangerous to stop at a stoplight because you could be carjacked just like out of nowhere. Did you experience or see any of that type of escalation in reference to the crimes? And do you think that has anything to do with the sanctions that the U.S. government has put on Venezuela?
They absolutely have to do with the sanctions, but also periodically, since Chavez's death in 2013, the United States has actually funded and directed violent riots in Venezuela. They're known as the Guarimbas. They happened in 2014, 2015, 2017. Guaido was a part of them, where basically these US-backed political parties agitated to get people in the streets. And then you have a bunch of thugs and criminals come out and build barriers, try to shut down trade and commerce throughout the country, actually strangling its economy even more, and also violently attacking citizens in the street, especially if they're identified as government supporters. So the U.S. has actively destabilized Venezuela in that way. But I mean, the crime, to be honest, when I was in Caracas for the first time in 2019, it wasn't the worst period. The worst period was 2015, right after Chavez died and the U.S. made this national security declaration. And as I kind of explained, that raised the cost of shipping to the country, and there was this major supply shortage. This is the first chapter of my book, as I talk about the economics of the economic war and try to explain how the U.S. deliberately collapsed Venezuela's economy, not only using my own analysis, but studies and analysis conducted by even opposition economists that are opposed to Chavez and Maduro. So it's not only me making these arguments, but so at that point in 2015, there was a massive supply shortage because for so long, Venezuela was a petrostate long before Chavez took over. It was a petrostate because it has the largest oil reserves in the world, and the West, namely Britain and the United States, colonized it, even though it was independent in name. U.S. Standard Oil was literally writing Venezuelan laws, and the IMF really had a grip on the country until Chavez took power. And what that meant was we just treated it as a big oil well. We extracted the oil and then didn't really want them to or allow them to develop their own industrial capacity. That's part of neoliberal development, is that if you're a country with resources, you don't necessarily have your own agricultural production. You don't have your own capacity to produce the basic goods that are sold in stores, because you are only there to give the West oil, and the West will import all of the necessary goods that you need and keep them cheap and unhealthy. And that's basically the model of neoliberal development. So when that supply shortage, or when those supplies were cut off as a result of US sanctions and a deliberate effort by the West, that's why it's designed where they make these countries dependent on you, because then they know they can close the valve and say, oh, look, you're screwed. You're not going to have toilet paper, and you're not going to have wheat and all of these different necessities that you use to take care of your people. And so in 2015, things are very bad. And there was a insane black market to purchase just basic goods. Cost of everything went up, and crime also went up as a result. And eventually, by the time I got there, inflation was still really high. That was also a result of sanctions. I explain why in the book, but products had at least returned to the shelves, and the government had initiated the CLAP program, which is like a direct delivery of basic supplies to families all across the country, millions every month. And so they curbed the main crisis that people talk about in terms of like the worst phase of Venezuelan modern history. It was also really bad previously. Before Chavez took over, there was crime and poverty, but no one really talked about it, at least not in the West. So I would say that when I got there in 2019, it's not a place that as a woman I would have walked around alone. But that's the same when I was just in Johannesburg in South Africa, same reality there. And honestly, pretty much the whole region, not something that I would do, and definitely not in Colombia or Brazil or any US aligned country as well. And, you know, I traveled to Honduras in 2019 as well, when it was led by Juan Orlando Hernandez, a major US ally who was, he was a de facto dictator. He was serving a second term, even though the Honduran constitution banned a second term. There was only a one-term limit. And he was running a narco state, as we now know, thanks to the indictment and guilty verdict in his brother's case. And now he's currently on trial for having really converted Honduras into a narco state, basically acting as the go-between the cartels in Colombia and Mexico. And so Honduras was extremely dangerous. I mean, for social activists, for journalists, for anyone. And Colombia also is very dangerous in that regard. So, I mean, Venezuela, of course, it was not a safe place. I mean, no one can get up here and say, like, no one can lie, but the picking on Venezuela is dishonest, because it overlooks the fact that there were a lot of these factors before Chavez anyway, overlooks the fact that the US actively funded violent street riots and crime in the country, overlooks the fact that the US drove the collapse of its economy, and overlooks the fact that US allies in the region are not really better off.
And these are the things I think that people really need to hear, because we were just talking about, recently we were talking about the border situation, and we were talking about that there's an influx of people coming across the border. And one of the countries that was mentioned, of course, was Venezuela. And to that point, we always point back to, are we going to mention the sanctions that the U.S. has put on Venezuela? I mean, if people are willing to risk their life to make that journey, because it's not like it's a easy journey for them to make, then obviously things must be really bad in their home country. And then I also point to the United States. You know, who supplied the weapons that the militant groups in Venezuela have? Like, where did they get those weapons? Where did that come from? And you know, you want to address the crime issue and you want to talk about the sanctions, and you put those two together, and it's like, There's a reason why people are fleeing that country. What do you think, or how do you feel when people say, because we've been talking about immigration a lot recently, how do you feel when people say, like, well, they shouldn't come here? Do you feel that they should be able to come here at least to ask for asylum or seek asylum? And how do you explain to people, like when people, particularly with that country, when people complain that all of them are coming here, how do you explain to people that, well, let me tell you what I saw when I was in Venezuela myself?
This is a really key question because the answer actually transcends the issue of sanctions altogether. Because what people need to understand about the current influx of Venezuelan asylum seekers and migrants at the southern border is that it is not only a result of US sanctions. I mean, that's kind of a talking point that I would have used in 2016, 2017, when migrants were leaving Venezuela. The reality is the people that are arriving at the border right now, from what I've read, including in the New York Times, all in mainstream media outlets, I have not had the chance to go to New York and speak to them myself, or I haven't done it here in DC either, just because of time. But from what I gather from reading those reports and from what I understand about Venezuelan migration in general, is that most of the people, if not like the vast majority of the people currently arriving from Venezuela, did not directly necessarily come from Venezuela, even though they're of Venezuelan nationality. What happened is during that period I described in 2015, 2016, 2017, when there was this massive supply shortage, when there was extreme, intense siege warfare, basically in the streets, conducted by these like armed groups and US-backed political parties. During that period, a lot of Venezuelans left. Partially also because of propaganda in the international media casting Venezuela as this hellhole. They thought, oh, life will be better in Colombia, life will be better in Peru, life would be better in Chile, life would be better in Brazil. And so they left most of them, a lot of them at that time, and then ended up in these neighboring Latin American countries. Well, what happened? Turned out life wasn't so great in those countries either, especially if you're a Venezuelan migrant or refugee. Turns out if you're poor in Latin America, life is not great, period. And once you leave your country, things become even more in flux. And then what? COVID came and devastated the region, especially economically. And this is the deciding factor and the major reason why all of the Venezuelans are coming now. Is because, so you have this situation that I just described where people had left the country years ago because of this man-made catastrophe, economic siege of Venezuela. People left. They're in these other countries now, devastated, poor, desperate. What does the Biden administration do immediately upon entering office? Approves temporary protective status for Venezuelan migrants. Yep. What is temporary protective status? It means that basically you can come to the United States and work before you have your official citizenship. And this was actually the main goal, one of the main policy positions that the Venezuelan opposition, or the shadow coup regime led by Juan Guaido, his officials in DC, Carlos Vecchio, a former ExxonMobil lawyer, that I write about extensively in the book, he was lobbying Trump and he was then lobbying Biden to approve TPS for Venezuelan migrants. This was like his top wish, because this is a guy who's basically appointed himself leader of the extremist Venezuelan opposition lobby in the United States, kind of like Jorge Masvidal, if anybody's familiar with how the Cubans operated in the 1990s and before. So what does that mean for him if he's in Miami and he's claiming that he's this ambassador of this fake government representing the US-backed opposition in Venezuela? What does he want? He wants his base to grow. He wants as many Venezuelan expats and anti-government activists coming to Miami and to the United States, because those are going to be people who are just his constituents. They're going to fuel his popularity and whatever the celebrity he's built for himself. And then they use that base as a weapon in the United States as a lobbying group to push the Democratic Party and to push the Republican Party into trying to overthrow the government in their homeland. That's their goal. So they need all these people, they need all these voters. And so Carlos Vecchio didn't get his wish with Trump. Though Trump initiated the coup, he did not approve TPS for Venezuelan migrants. It wasn't until Biden made that decision that migrants started to show up at the border, and they were coming from Chile, they were coming from Peru, having left Venezuela years ago. But my friends in Venezuela tell me, once Biden did that and approved TPS for Venezuelan migrants, of course, even people in the country are going to think, well, this is my chance to go and have a better life in the United States. A lot of people around the world, if presented with that opportunity, saying that they're going to get special status, would take it, not knowing necessarily the reality of life once you show up in the country and are a construction worker or a nanny for some family that's abusive and you don't really have any rights. And ultimately, the elite in this country want that. They want to import this slave labor class, and that's why it's the perfect policy. And then on top of it, they get to say, oh, look at all these Venezuelan migrants. The socialist dictator is so bad. It's really the perfect storm, but it's also, with the right information, very simple to break down. And I hope that people can start to understand what I just laid out about the immigration issue, because I know without a doubt that the fact that these Venezuelans are showing up will be weaponized against the Venezuelan state. So it's really important that people are aware of these facts that I just explained, because I think it really shatters the idea that this is all happening because of some communist dictatorship.
Another thing that you said that I think is really important is that he lobbied both parties. So this is what I've been trying to explain to people. Like, he wasn't like, oh, is it a Republican or is it a Democrat? No, he was trying to lobby both parties to get what he wanted to get accomplished. But I think you're 100% right. This is very important for people to understand, because there was a recent journalist, he was on Rising, I think it was a couple months ago, and he was pushing back and he was saying like, no, it's not because of the sanctions. It's all because of socialism. And that's why people have to flee. And so it's important that people get to hear this other side of the story, because a lot of people have been repeating that narrative.
And it's not even just the sanctions anymore. I think that talking point is outdated. I would like to retire it. I would like to really be specific about what happened here. These people came from other countries, US allied countries that are not in great situations either, capitalist countries that are, if you're poor, again, you're not having a great life. So that is what's driving this. And the decision of the Biden administration to basically send out a bat signal and say, hey, if you're Venezuelan, come here.
Yep. Very good points, Anya. So I know that you've traveled a lot. Do you ever worry, when you travel to certain areas? Have you ever had to worry for your safety? For example, I know you went to Israel before. Were you ever worried for your safety when you go to certain areas in the world?
No, I guess I would say that I try not to worry or be scared in life, period. So I think if I did, I wouldn't do it, or I wouldn't be able to. I can't really say that I ever felt threatened.
That's good. It's good. Okay, so I want to get to this point here about RFK Jr. So we all know now. I didn't know at the time, when he announced his campaign. I did not know. I covered his campaign announcement here in Boston on the ground. He talked for a long time, and I thought he said really great things. Really great things. I was very surprised when I heard his position in reference to Israel and Palestine. I was like, what is this? He didn't mention this at all, during his announcement. So it was very strange to me, especially since, he spoke out heavily against the war in Ukraine. He spoke out against the CIA, these government agencies. And so it was very clear to me that he understands the problem with the deep state as well. So I'm curious, when you first met him or you first spoke to him, were you aware of his position in reference to Israel and Palestine? And if not, how do you feel about that now?
No, I had no idea until it started with him making a statement on Israel's Independence Day, also known as basically the Nakba or catastrophe to most of the world and to Palestinians, which is when Israel declared its random authority over a land that was mostly Arab, Palestinian, previously under the authority of the Ottoman Empire. Just thanks to the United Nations, randomly declared this little slice of it Israel, and then they ethnically cleansed Palestinians from their home. I've been in Jerusalem, for example, and visited the New York Times bureau office there, which was purchased by Thomas Friedman, the brilliant neoliberal thinker who brought us concepts like, oh, countries that don't have McDonald's, or the countries that have McDonald's don't go to war with each other. That's his golden arches theory of international affairs. He's a brilliant man, obviously. He actually purchased that bureau, or the home that is the residence of if you're the New York Times bureau chief in Jerusalem, that's where you live. And the story of that house really tells the whole story of Palestine. In 1947, that home belonged to the Karmi family, the patriarch of which was the lead broadcaster for BBC Arabic at the time. And they were forcibly marched out of their home at gunpoint, just like many Palestinians were across the territory. And today that house belongs to the New York Times. Well, that is a metaphor for Palestine, the entire territory. And so I've seen it myself. And it started with him, again, as I was saying, on Israeli Independence Day, paying some lip service to Israel and kind of just speaking favorably about it in a way that I thought was weird. But I'm like, okay, you're running for president. I actually do understand pretty much that if you're running a serious campaign, there's a certain amount of lip service that you have to pay. You're not going to be elected president of the country and have a position that I have on Israel-Palestine. But then from there, he took it further and further to the point that he was doing pretty much open lobbying, doing an event called Making the Case for Israel. Once he announced that event alongside Rabbi Shmuley Boteach, who's just a race hustling front for the Adelson Money Network and just total vile human being. When he was doing that event, Making the Case for Israel, I'm shocked because, first of all, forget what I think about Israel. You're running for president of the United States. It's not appropriate for you to be making the case for any other foreign country that would just not be accepted for any. Oh, I'm going to make the case for Mexico. I'm going to make for the case for China. Imagine if you were running for president and did that. What? Okay, you're running for U.S. president, making the case for Israel. To whom? Who are you trying to convince? That's one thing that I didn't understand totally. And why are you doing this? Because it undermines all of your positions. You're against medical apartheid. Yep. All of that was tested in Israel. You're against the vaccine and this untested vaccine. Well, to the level that it was tested in Israel. You're against the war in Ukraine. Well, Israel is a pea in a pod with Ukraine, a U.S. basically sucking our tax base dry, sustaining itself with our money, and constantly getting us into regional conflicts and war that are actually not in our interest, but only in Israel's interest or Ukraine's interest. They're very similar in that way. I mean, technically, our national security is not Ukraine's nor Israel's, but they have this thing in common where they've brainwashed so many people into thinking that we need to go fight for their existence. And so it undermined, in my view, his position on all of these other points. And then on top of that, the fact that he was making this big deal about Dr. Peter Hotez refusing to debate him and making this big stink about free speech and open discussion. Yet when presented with the opportunity to have a conversation with people who really support him, I mean, support him in the sense that even not necessarily I'm not talking about what we do in the voting booth. Someone like me or Max, who I'm speaking on behalf of Max because he's my husband and works with me at the Gray Zone and was at the center of this thing. But just support in theory, also just what he's doing in terms of disrupting the political system and having a reckoning with our history, talking about the deep state, just supporting that in theory, we genuinely wanted to engage in a conversation with him and tell him why he was wrong based on his own principles. And then he refused. Not only refused, doubled down when he was speaking with Jimmy Dore, and basically the worst thing you can do, one of the worst things I think you can do as a human being, and I mean, honestly, especially if you're a Catholic or a Christian, to call the Palestinians terrorists and blame them for the treatment and the war and apartheid, like ethnic cleansing actively going on to this day, in the way that he did to me is a sin. It's a sin on humanity. And so I really couldn't tolerate that. Calling the Palestinians basically all terrorists in order to justify Israeli raids on Palestinian homes. I've been there. I've been to Gaza. I've met women whose husbands died because Israel did not allow them to leave their prison. Gaza is a prison, in order to get the proper medical treatment they needed in Israel. I've met the women who've died, or who's have lost husbands to that, who could have gotten basic treatment. I've met people who've had their olive trees and farms burned down by Israeli settlers, who are some of the most just nasty human beings you could ever imagine. Just go look up any video of them on the internet and you'll see what I mean. To the people that killed children. And he really tried to say that Israel never kills civilians on purpose, despite the fact that it's actually high-level generals in the Israeli military have articulated their strategy of mowing the lawn, an actual policy of the military to every once in a while just go clean out a couple thousand Palestinian bodies from the territory, because they're basically in a war of demographics and they want to win. The Jews are not the majority, but they want to control the land. So it's apartheid. They have to keep cutting down the Palestinian grass. That's a stated policy of the Israeli military. And Max writes all about that in his books. I don't think RFK Jr. was prepared to confront those facts and to engage in an open discussion on Palestine. And unfortunately, that makes him a hypocrite. And as I say, when it comes to Palestine, to throw them under the bus and to be claiming to stand up for humanity, it's just a sin. You cannot recover from that, in my view, unless you come to see the truth and see the light.
I totally hear you. I mean, what's really weird to me is the Dennis Kucinich connection, because Dennis Kucinich, has been very vocal in the past about the rights for the Palestinian people when it wasn't popular for a lot of people to do so back then. He definitely understands the situation in Israel and Palestine. And so I said to myself, well, Dennis Kucinich is his campaign manager. Dennis knows how the Palestinian people are being treated. So I just said to myself, I don't understand why RFK doesn't get this, or why he has not heard this other perspective, or are there other people in his ear telling him don't listen to that side of the story? To me, it was really weird. I know a lot of people, at least that watch this show, were like, they wanted to see that conversation. They're like, we want to see that conversation with RFK and Max. And I think people thought that was going to happen like pretty soon, because RFK also said in another interview when he was in Iowa, he said, I'm going to be talking to Max Blumenthal in the next couple of weeks about this, because I don't want people to think that I am a Zionist. So so the rest of us are just kind of sitting around and we're like, is this conversation happening? Because it's just, he has to correct this rhetoric. Like, he has to. And I don't know if you noticed, but his poll numbers actually decreased like after all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's really no question in my mind, unfortunately, that it comes down to money. I just don't see why someone would get up there with a race hustler and a hateful supremacist. I mean, he's a version of a white supremacist. He's a Jewish supremacist, a Zionist. That's all that it is. Shmuley Boteach, and make a case for an apartheid regime, unless we all know how powerful the lobby that Shmuley represents. I mean, he's an open, pretty much operative, bringing in this Sheldon Adelson money front for that network. I just don't doubt that's you don't do an event like that unless you're getting something in return, or unless you're just an awful person. And I actually don't think RFK Jr. is, based on his other positions. I would think that if he went to Palestine and saw what I saw, he would agree with me if he were going to be honest and open in his heart. Again, especially as a Catholic. It's not the Palestinians who built a wall through the birthplace of Jesus Christ. It was the Israeli regime with our taxpayer money. So I think it's really important to continue talking about this, and hopefully he'll hear it eventually. But I would also take a good look at who's providing him security right now, while the Biden administration is refusing to give him Secret Service protection. Just look up who that security firm is operated by, and if there's any country or any intelligence service that it has a connection with.
Very interesting. I want to pivot back to Latin America for just a second. So we also have been discussing BRICS on this show, which seems to be growing. Saudi Arabia recently it was announced that Saudi Arabia has been invited to join BRICS, which is really interesting considering Saudi Arabia is supposed to be technically an ally of the United States. So it'll be interesting to see how this goes. How do you feel about Lula, the president of Brazil? Do you feel that he is, a positive aspect for the people of Brazil? Or do you feel like there are some criticisms with him as well? Or do you feel like this is the right direction for Latin America to go towards like a BRICS and to try to make their own currency? I heard there were talks of that as well, and moving away from the US dollar.
Yeah, I was at the BRICS summit in Johannesburg when they announced the new additions, including Saudi Arabia, which was incredibly exciting. And it's interesting you ask about Brazil. I've never been to Brazil. I can't claim to be an expert in the way that I can say that I know Venezuela, for example. I don't speak Portuguese either. But just from my understanding of the region and how politics work, I mean, Brazil is its own animal. I don't think it can be defined in the same way that other Latin American countries can, in the sense that between all of them, Venezuela was this petrostate that for years was at the behest of the West, or subservient to the West. Brazil also, of course, was integrated into the neoliberal IMF system, but it was a major industrial and agricultural powerhouse. So it has its own fuel, its own kind of way, and it's huge. It's huge. It has its own weight to throw around on the continent in a sovereign way that other powers, such as Venezuela, even if they're very wealthy, do not have. And so I don't think like Bolsonaro, he's such a fascinating figure to me because he really authentically does represent a big section of the Brazilian political bloc. And so I don't think necessarily that the US views on Bolsonaro and Lula are as cut and dry as they would be on, for example, Maduro in Venezuela versus the right wing. I think they were wary of both because Bolsonaro and Lula can both kind of throw their own weight around and not necessarily always bow to the United States. And one thing you can say about Bolsonaro is that he's absolutely a nationalist in the sense that he believed in Brazil as a sovereign state. He was not going necessarily to do what the West wanted. Doesn't mean that he would also be so enthusiastic about BRICS, because for other reasons he's hostile to China. But at the end of the day, Brazil, kind of like India, India in a more extreme way, they are these huge powers that are kind of non-aligned. They can't be defined. They can't be swayed and pushed around by the West or what is considered the East. They're just their own thing. And so Lula, in terms of whether or not it's right for the Brazilian people, I guess that's really up to them to decide. But I do hesitate, or I wonder sometimes about his political strength right now, considering he did basically just come out of jail, then immediately launch his campaign. And I'm not sure how strong he is politically. I'm not sure whether or not he could be swayed by forces that might not necessarily be as progressive or open-minded about the world as some of us would hope. But I mean, honestly, what disturbs me the most about his presidency at this point is that I do not like the way that he has mirrored the Democratic Party in terms of, and the deep state here in the United States in terms of how he's prosecuting and persecuting Bolsonaro and the people who rushed the Capitol or the Brazilian legislature in like what they call the January 6th. I think it was like January 8th in Brazil. I don't, whenever I see a state handing down harsh political sentences for people like the January 6th protesters or now the January 8th in Brazil, I am uncomfortable because also in some ways it looks like he's turned around and done to Bolsonaro exactly what the right did to him. It's a lawfare campaign in my view. But in this case, I mean, in Venezuela and in Nicaragua and plenty of other places, people like that are often jailed for violent uprisings, but they are almost always the US government, and US government funding is right there behind them. I mean, there's like a clear conspiracy going on. In Brazil's case, I'm not sure that it's the same. The people who I think rushed the legislature were part of the Bolsonaro base, and I just can't support that. I see the way that liberal-minded Western media are covering what Lula is doing in that regard and kind of celebrating it as if it's, very similar to our January 6th. And I'm a little bit turned off by that, or very turned off by that, I should say. But again, that's just my opinion. I'm not Brazilian, and it's up to them what they want to do.
So recently, you were in Tampa. I believe you had a chance to cover part of like the Uhuru. So for people who are not aware, especially a lot of newer people watching now, Amali Yeshitela, Chairman Amali Yeshitela, he came onto the show way back before they were arrested. So this was right after they were raided in St. Petersburg, Florida. He talked about what happened that day. And then it seemed like not too long after that interview actually is when they came for them and they arrested them. The DOJ had been watching them, it seems like, for quite a while. I didn't really feel like they had evidence really to go after them, but they decide these things on their own. What did you see and hear in reference to the Uhuru trial, and how does it look for them going forward?
This is an incredibly important case. I was dismayed that I was the only reporter to make it into the room. There was no national reporter there. Otherwise, local Fox in Tampa, I will say, give them credit, did send someone to cover the press conference after the fact, but there was no one in that room, despite the fact that this case threatens to, as the defense lawyer who argued last Thursday, September 26th, Leonard Goodman, said, threatens to blow a hole in the First Amendment. If this case actually goes to trial, and then if the co-defendants are found guilty, it will mean that pretty much political speech and activity in the United States, which is supposed to be protected, or is protected, not supposed to be, is protected by the First Amendment, is criminalized in a way that has never happened before in the history of our country. And before I explain anything further, I should give just an ethical disclaimer here. Len Goodman, the lawyer who I just referenced, who argued in favor or on the defense this past Thursday, is a primary benefactor of the gray zone. Without his support and basically the fact that he took a chance on us years ago, there's absolutely no way that I could have done any of my work. And so I'm proud to say that, because Len is a great lawyer and someone who in this case is really working single-handedly to defend the First Amendment. In fact, he got involved with the case thanks to Aaron Mate, my colleague, actually tipping him off about it. And so I have to say that for ethical reasons, I do have this relationship with Len, and that he does have this financial relationship with the Gray Zone, but I'm in a lot of ways, or in every way, proud to say that. That being said, the trial is set to go forward in February. What this hearing I covered last week, or what I attended, my coverage will come out this week because I have to get a court transcript and all that fun stuff to do a really proper write-up. What this hearing was Len arguing the attorney, the defense team, arguing a motion to dismiss the case altogether, saying, look, do not even take this to trial because this case, on the basis of its existence, is a violation of the First Amendment. It should not even go. In fact, Len and the defendants make this case, as do the other defense attorneys, that even if this goes to trial, that is already harassment, because they've already restricted these three co-defendants' movement. They're like effectively on some sort of probation where they get home visits, where they're innocent now. They haven't been proven guilty of any crime. But if it goes to trial, that prolongs this period of mistreatment for them. It racks up legal costs. It would effectively equal harassment, and it is a chilling effect. It sends a message to anyone else engaged in the kind of legal political activity, First Amendment political activity that these people were engaged in, that they should be afraid. And so that is really the argument that the attorneys were putting forward last week. The fact that this case could even go to trial is already basically taking a wrecking ball to the First Amendment. And why is that? Well, basically, the crux of the case against these three individuals is that they conspired with a Russian national in order to sow discord in the United States. That's the language of the US government. But in the actual indictment, they list dozens, close to 100 examples of what they say are the overt acts that prove there was this conspiracy. I mean, the US government says there's a multi-year conspiracy on behalf of these three co-defendants, the Uhuru Three, to sow discord in the US on behalf of the Russian state. And basically they're saying that these people failed to register as agents of the Russian state while carrying out their political activity, because according to US code, if you are not a diplomat of a foreign government, but you are acting on their behalf in some way in the United States, you have to register as a foreign agent. Of course, as the defense team pointed out, unless you work for the Brookings Institution, or I don't know, I could say the APAC, for example, if you work for the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, as a lobbyist for the Israeli government, you don't have to register as a foreign agent, according to the US government. Only if you're a black or white, honestly, because two of the three co-defendants are white, opponent of the Biden administration or the Democratic Party in Florida with an influential voice, are you a target for this kind of registration? So already on that level, the argument falls apart, right? How are you going to require, even if what they say is true, which I can get into why it's not about these three co-defendants, but even if what they say is true, that they were paid by the Russian government to go on a reparations tour, despite the fact that the Uhuru movement and its leaders have been advocating for reparations for decades. In fact, they were founded long before this Russian national who's accused of funding them even ever was born. And they're actually credited with making reparations a household term in the United States because of their work on that issue, regardless of what you think of it. That they're somehow doing this because even if we accept the government's argument that they're somehow doing this because the Russian government paid them and asked them to do it, well, then what are you going to do about K Street? What are you going to do about all of the lobbyists on K Street that are openly paid by the government of Saudi Arabia, the government of UAE, Israel, the government of the United States, well, United Kingdom, I guess. I mean, are you going to make all of them register also as agents? This is the logical outcome of what they're arguing, but of course we know it would never be applied to those allies of the Biden regime or deep state. So that just on, I can argue that on kind of like an easy rhetorical level, but if you want to talk more about the details of the case or what was argued in the trial, or I'm happy to do that as well.
I think like this is what we've been trying to warn people about for quite some time. When people said they were tired of hearing about free Julian Assange, when people said they were tired of hearing about the Twitter files, when people said they were tired of hearing about the censorship issue, they were tired of hearing about people being deplatformed, people being kicked off of PayPal and Venmo and all these other various platforms. We were trying to warn people what was coming. I just saw a tweet from Glenn Greenwald, actually, right before I went live. Apparently, Canada is trying to create some law now that, like, if you have a podcast, I guess in particular, a political podcast, you have to register with the government. Like, this is very scary, like very scary time. So I want people to understand, like, once they come for your voice, you don't really have anything else left. So it's really important that we continue to fight for free speech, whether you agree with what someone's saying or not. It can still come back and affect you. I remember when Trump was removed from Twitter, and there were a lot of people cheering, say, "Yay, he's gone, woohoo!" And then people on the left started getting hit as well. And so that's the thing. Like, this is not going to just affect one political side. It's going to come around to everyone. So what were some of the things that were said during the trial?
What I saw on Thursday was an insult to me as an American citizen and taxpayer, and should be considered an insult and actually an assault on the American citizen and the American taxpayer, because what was going on in that courtroom is that the Justice Department, lawyers that are paid with your tax dollars and mine, meaning basically your and my salary, yours and my, that the government takes and decides that these very these ambitious young lawyers are worthy of our hard-earned money. What they're now doing with those resources they are waging a war on our rights, our guaranteed constitutional rights as American citizens. As Len Goodman, the attorney representing the defense, said in court, there was a First Amendment for a reason. Our founders believed that free speech and political activity had to be the basis of their vision for a free society and country. And so once we lose the First Amendment, we lose everything that comes after it. And the way Len put it is that this is part of a trend of the United States government now, and it's been going on especially since 9/11, basically, to roll back our freedoms through things like the Patriot Act. Mm-hmm. But they're taking political speech and activity that they don't like, labeling it as something that is wrong or criminal in order to criminalize what is supposed to be the basis of our country, the fact that we can get out in the street and say whatever we want. And again, all of the pieces of evidence that the government lists as supposedly proving this vast conspiracy were all public activity, political activity, and protected speech that the co-defendants engaged in the United States. So they talk about articles that they published at their newspaper. They talked about petitions in favor of reparations or denouncing what they say is the genocide of Black Americans. These are all the activities that the United States government apparently considered criminal. But the problem is those are all protected activities and speech. So even if, and as they allege that basically this Russian national, who they've not demonstrated or proven that this person is even a representative of the Russian government. That's not a fact at this point in time. So even if it's just a Russian person, and this is where we're getting into how it's it's really a question of how Russiagate, years and years and years of media-induced, top-down Russiagate hysteria, where if you're a Russian person who just speaks Russian, you are considered this representative of an evil network that is like trying to sow discord and overthrow our government and create some sort of revolution here in the US. Right? That's how people have been programmed to think. If they watch MSNBC every night, or even if they watch CNN, or if they're basically not a Trumper, then a lot of people just take that as fact. If you're Russian, you're already suspect. And so the US government, the DOJ, were capitalizing on this in order to cast these three defendants, co-defendants, two of them who are over 70 years old. They were actually arguing that they are national security threats to the United States by just saying things like they were talking to a Russian national, or maybe they allege that they got $7,000 or a little bit more maybe to get from this Russian national to do a tour about reparations in the United States, as if they were doing that because the Russian government told them. No, they were just wanted money to do what they were already doing for decades and decades and decades. But the US government is saying, no, it doesn't matter. Just the fact that they have this relationship means that their action was criminal. And what the defense is saying is that those relationships, even if they got money from this Russian national and then went on a tour, that's not proving that they're agents of the Russian government, even if that individual is a representative of the Russian government, which, by the way, again, they haven't demonstrated in court yet. So they have taken a list of normal activities that Americans engage in every day all across the country and criminalized them basically based on just some friendship or relationship that they had with someone in Russia. And if this precedent goes through, that, I mean, it's not going to be the Brookings Institute that they go after. It's going to be other kinds of journalists and people who oppose the state. So the precedent is very clear and dangerous. And it's also very clear to me, after going there and meeting the co-defendants and the larger Huru network, that these people were targeted specifically because they are a thorn in the side of the Democratic Party establishment. Not only were they targeted in the 90s in basically a move-style assault on their headquarters because they were leading the charge against their public opposition to what was essentially a police killing execution of a teenager in the street. This was back in the 90s. They were targeted with helicopters and fire bombs, and there was this armed confrontation between the civilians and the police in St. Petersburg way back then. And then more recently, they ran local city council and mayoral candidates who really messed with the Democratic Party. In fact, even caused a split in the official Democratic Party in that area. So what are the DOJ doing? And I mean, of course, the lawyers can't say this. They wouldn't say this because they're lawyers, but I'm saying this just as an observer and a journalist. It's very clear to me. The DOJ sat there and said, look, we need something to not only keep this Russiagate insanity alive, we also need a legal precedent that we can now weaponize against everybody else in terms of their free speech and their political activity and their public writings. Who's the best target? Okay, why not go after this activist group in Florida that has been pissing us off for decades? And that is what happened. They raided the home of the chairman of the Huru movement in a pre-dawn raid. He's like 80 years old. They flew a drone into his house and zip tied him, actually, and his wife left them in the street while they raided the home. By the way, they were not shown an arrest or a search warrant until after the raid had already taken place, which is there. You're already seeing the level of constitutional violation, misconduct that was happening with this persecution of them. But at that point, they hadn't even been indicted. Okay, so basically what happened was the United States government indicted these Russian nationals that they accuse of being of sowing discord in the United States last year, then carried out and named these three people that are now on trial as unnamed co-conspirators. And it seems that the U.S. then the government conducted these raids on the Uhuru headquarters and on the homes and private residences of people that are involved, because they thought maybe they could get them on something. If they could just get their computers, seize everything, then they could come up with maybe some mathematical budgeting error, or what they could characterize as fraud, something that could justify them going further against the 3 co-defendants now. And they didn't get anything. They didn't get anything substantial, as evidenced by the indictment, which the defense made a very clear case last week does not stand up against the First Amendment, because there's just nothing there.
This feels like McCarthyism, Anya.
It is. In fact, and this is where the fact that I'm not a legal expert and haven't dedicated myself to like absorbing every aspect of and all the terminology becomes evident. But one of the points that the defense made was one of the examples of the cases that the government cites as fueling their prosecution of the Uhuru 3 has to do with a case that actually involved like the board under McCarthyism that was deciding who was communist and who was not, and who was a Soviet asset and who's not. But that board, which is the whole basis of that case, has been disbanded because it's considered one of the most shameful chapters in our history, when we actually had a government board doing that kind of review in order to curb the constitutionally guaranteed rights of Americans. So what the DOJ is doing now, yes, is they are asking for a return to McCarthyism. I mean, that they want, and it's even more broad-based, because they're not only going to be going after leftists or socialists or communists this time around. You know, they're going to go after the Trump people too. They're going to go after the RFK people too. They're going to go against anybody that is not part of the unipolar or uniparty pro-war deep state establishment. Like, we are all in the same boat right now.
That's right. All right, Anya, I have one more question for you. I've asked this question to a lot of journalists that have come onto the show. So I'm going to do a part 2 of this, apparently, because people said you got to ask other people this question too. So what advice would you give to anyone who's interested in being an investigative journalist like yourself, particularly one that is independent?
Don't go to journalism school. In fact, unless you really want to, don't go to college, period, because you read a lot of history books. You know, if you're going to go to school and you want to get a degree, study something like political history, American history, world history. Pick something that is your interest, or even criminal law. I mean, that would help me a lot more if I'd had the attention span to get a law degree, but then I'd be a lawyer. But I feel like I'm constantly learning in my job. That's part of being an investigative reporter, is that I'm just a permanent university student. I'm always learning new law terms, or like, that's part of the whole, that's just, you kind of never grow up or graduate, because otherwise you couldn't do your job. You wouldn't be learning and processing. So if you want to study something, or if you're in school, don't study journalism. Pick something that is just going to give you a basis for what you're interested in, and understanding what you're interested in and how you want to approach it as a journalist. And then from there, I mean, just do what you see so many people doing right now. For everything that is wrong with our current media landscape and the criticisms that you and your audience and I would all have of outlets like what we're on right now, or of X or Twitter, any of this social media that we're so dependent on, as much as I can criticize it all day, the truth is we still do have this amazing ability right now, where if you pick up a microphone or grab your keyboard and just start talking or start writing, it's very possible, if you're very committed and you have the talent, that you will succeed. That might mean that for a while you have to work another job. I know people have this idea of like, what is an acceptable, I hate that though. Like, journalists think that they're different than people that are like working day jobs or night jobs to put food on the table or to pay their rent. That is the American worker experience. All right. So even if you have to do that, and you are very still interested in writing or podcasting or whatever, you should do it. And you should just have confidence in yourself, and also never be afraid to ask people for advice, because I personally, I'm always happy to I've had a great experience just even at the Gray Zone working with younger reporters that come up, and people that work for us or have some of our closest colleagues now are people who really did at one point just reach out and say, hey, this is who I am, this is what I do, and can I be of service, or can we work together? That's how I got my start in journalism. I just took a chance. So take a chance and have faith in yourself, and don't go to journalism school.
Well said. All right, Anya, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me, Sabby. This was really fun, and you asked really good questions.